So good afternoon, everybody, from rainy Tennessee. I've decided to try something new when offering my two-bit commentary about the issues of our day and see if I couldn't by chance assemble a video piece. Now this is a little bit lengthy, so I'll go ahead and dive right in. I kind of come up with this idea that we're in an era of stagnation through parallelization. Kind of my assertion here is that, while looking to get to the roots of why we don't seem to have any social movements in our time that, are lasting, and why more people are kind of unplugging from social and political conversations. And of course, it didn't take long to realize that some of the main reasons are the same reasons that we have become incredibly hyper-partisan and even ugly towards one another in our conversations. Now, I noticed a large number of people falling into basically one of three groups. One of the groups are basically people who say that the world is broken because of the views and actions of that other group, who happen to be wholly wrong, are completely wrong about everything, and at the same time that other group is asserting basically the same thing, but for nearly opposite reasons. Now, sadly, I happen to think that they are both right, even if they are for unequivocal reasons. But, of course, getting either to admit their culpability is, as we all know, basically impossible. Now, those that do unplug or refuse to engage most often seem to do so not because they don't have opinions, but because they worry about incurring the wrath of those who might disagree. And they disagree by way of hurling insults ad hominem, and will eventually lead to what is known as Goodwin's Law, which is kind of an internet adage that states that if conversations carry on long enough on the internet, they will all eventually end up at Hitler. Now, a good number of people here in the United States, where, of course, many of us are often taught from an early age that we should never talk about politics, race, or religion, like the dinner table, because we do risk contentious conversations, which many believe are best avoided, in favor of kumbaya small talk in order to preserve continuity and harmony. In fact, we've taken this idea to the extreme that disagreeing today is often viewed by many people as simply rude. So we kind of start out a bit handicapped in terms of even knowing how to have a meaningful dialogue with each other, and we find ourselves more often having conversations in order to reply instead of trying to understand, and it's kind of a damn shame. Now, the roots and causes of our kind of current situation are, of course, they're complex, and they're varied. There is no simple answers to things. And I would say that this goes back at least a half a century prior. Now, it's in part through design, like things through the use of public relations marketing towards personal self-interest, direct government engagement through things like perception management and social engineering. But kind of as time went by, we see that there was also the unintended consequence that there's an ever-increasingly complex society, and I think we're beginning to realize that there's a growing inability to manage it. So, just an example, let's look just how much our society has changed in a relatively short period of time. When we go back to the 50s, and it's not that it was a perfect time, certainly, but there existed this era of the man in the gray flannel suit, kind of an era of conformity, continuity, and general stability. It was an era where our society often spoke about things like community, social responsibility, commitment to our national collective, in each other, as well as a strong belief that, we had social and political institutions that worked. Government could actually do things, that could accomplish things. So, here's a typical film clip of the day.
Fall has come to Millwood, the city where Richard Anderson lives. A city neither small nor large, Simply a normal community where people live together, work together, and do things for each other.
Now, in the 10 to 15 years that followed, things changed pretty drastically, and we kind of entered an era of hyper-individualism during the 1960s. You know, we saw the rise of the civil rights movement, we had the issues of Vietnam, and public perception or belief in our public institutions and government kind of began to wane. And because government was unable to kind of address a lot of these issues. And at the same time, we saw what was essentially the last great social movement in America. It was a combination of civil rights, the anti-war movement, ERA, feminism, things of this nature. And it was effective. It was actually damn effective. And of course, this was some concern to government. And it also forced government and businesses to adapt in order to better control civil unrest and kind of adapt how it would address this in the future moving forward. Take a look at this clip.
During the 1960s, the restless energy of youth exploded as the post-war baby boomers came of age. And the times, they were a-changin'. For many, it was a time to turn on, tune in, and drop out. It was the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and distrust of authority, and the social unrest reached into every corner of society. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and his brother Robert Kennedy were assassinated in the 1960s, and the U.S. got further entrenched in Vietnam. But the decade produced many positive, lasting changes as well. Civil rights legislation was signed, and women pushed for their own equal rights.
Now, as we came out of the 60s and heading into the 70s, to give you an idea just how concerned government was with people becoming thoughtful people. They were becoming educated and free-thinking and anti-establishment. They no longer kind of held government with the same reverence that they did like in the 50s. And in fact, even though during Jimmy Carter, a pretty liberal group of people had a report written for what is known as the Trilateral Commission, and you can all read it. I certainly recommend you Google it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. And the purpose was on governability of democracies, and this was written in 1975. Now, the report observed that in the United States, problems of governments, and this is quote, stem from an excess of democracy, unquote. And thus, it advocated to fix this by, quote, to restore the prestige and authority of central government institutions. Now get your mind around that. The government, even a very liberal and tolerant one, saw what happened in the 60s and post-Vietnam era, said the problem was that people are thinking for themselves a little bit too much. And we couldn't really have anybody there. People's not relying on the government like they should. We're not leaning on Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam's having problems. So one of the methods that they've kind of adopted to deal with this, and this is what the basis of this report was to go through various means of how do we again, quote, to restore the prestige and authority of central government institutions. Now, of course, one of these methods was to change the narrative, the national narrative, through extensive use of basically public relations, marketing, whatever you want to call it. And, keep in mind, this is an era, of our perceived defeat in Vietnam. We had an inflationary economy. And, of course, some of you may be familiar with the somewhat famous and mischaracterized speech from Jimmy Carter called the Malaise speech, in which our president asked people to save energy by putting on a sweater, put more air in their tires. In other words, to sacrifice, kind of in and an easier method than to say John F. Kennedy. But he tried to point out that Americans need to sacrifice a little bit for their country. Well, after everything that's going on, Americans just weren't going to have any of that. Not when the alternative was Ronald Reagan and this ascending movement at the time of kind of right-wing libertarianism, free market capitalism that kind of came up. It was morning in America. And don't worry, the government will take care of everything for you. Everything's under control. It's fine. Go shopping. Live a good life, spend some money, buy a house, everything's right. And we took this to almost like a religious theme. You saw it reflected in elections at the time. We were referred to as the shining city on a hill. And later on, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, under Clinton, later stated that, and this is a real famous quote, you can Google this one as well, "We are an indispensable nation. We stand tall and see further than other countries into the future, and we see the danger here to all of us." Now this kind of set in motion a manner of thinking, a theme, again, the national narrative, of American exceptionalism. And we began to believe it. After all, who wants the drag of having to sacrifice, when it's a lot easier to go shopping? We wanted the easy way, Don't worry, be happy. And we took this to a point that the laws eventually that applied to other people didn't really apply to us, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. After all, Americans are an exceptional people. And this is essentially what is perception management through basically marketing, PR, and social engineering. We have formed a narrative and a view. Now it's up to us to fulfill that role and that live. And of course, during the 80s and 90s, we saw movies out of Hollywood. We saw things like the Brat Pack and BMWs and Swatches, movies like Wall Street, where we're kind of bombarded with this notion that greed is good, the Gordon Gekko era. It was hyper-consumerism. And eventually it culminated in one of the wildest kind of cult flicks at the time called American Psycho, which kind of took this to absurd levels of hyper-consumerism and our capitalist society taken to obscene levels. If you haven't seen it, you may want to check it out, but it's pretty twisted and brutal. Okay? Now, of course, another method to return governmental control, back to government over society was through the use of economics. Now, this was achieved, of course, by, as Alan Greenspan, the former federal chairman, said in a Senate committee meeting back in 1997. And this is the era of deregulation and repeal of Glass-Steagall and things of this nature, that he kind of bragged before the committee that said that one of the reasons why our economy was so successful during this time was due to, get a load of this, worker insecurity. Now, in the past few decades, as more women came into the job place, labor markets kind of tightened up. There were a lot more people, and there were fewer jobs available. So a lot of these jobs were part-time, seasonal, things of this nature. And those people who did work full-times became more insecure in their jobs. They were worried due to competition. There was an insecurity that they would be willing to forego things like wage increases in exchange for job security. So in essence, what this was is people, out of fear of losing their jobs, became much more complacent towards business. And of course, in some regards, this certainly did keep us more competitive with in a global community, because now we could better compete with people like Mexico and Asia, and American companies could squeeze the American labor force more than it ever has. And of course, wages stagnated. Now, keep in mind, though, during this same period of time, we saw a huge decline in things like unions. And this is something both parties kind of engaged in. And in fact, traditionally, the Democratic Party was always the party of labor. But it was through basically the 90s, starting with, of course, Reagan, the whole air traffic controllers. Some of you remember that. But even the Democrats turned their back on organized labor. There was better ways of getting money when you had people like Citibank and Lehman Brothers out there willing to fork it over. So they didn't have to depend on labor for votes. Now, of course, during this period, we saw a further merger of government and business. Again, through the absurd and obscene amounts of money that's in politics today. It simply cost millions of dollars even to run in a humble congressional campaign in some small district. And who's the Congress person going to listen to? You, who may have donated $5, $10, $100? Or perhaps a special interest group or a super PAC that's funded by, say, Citibank, which happens to donate tens of thousands of dollars. In fact, this disparity of influence of money in our politics was the focus of a study from Princeton and Northwestern universities, and they concluded that basically America is now an oligarchy, more so than it's a democracy. And in essence, people basically have zero voice in how the government functions or votes. And of course, again, this is due to money. Now, it's also during this period of time that we saw a rise of a new world take place, and it was known as the Internet. Now, in this place, this is where we had West Coast techno-utopians from Silicon Valley. Now, many of them predicted that we would be able to escape to this place free of government or authority, a place where it was purely free expression and we had safety through anonymity. And we might even achieve some form of self-actualization. After all, we could exchange information and ideas with people all around the world. And it would help us become enlightened, elevated, and of course egalitarian all at the same time. However, people began to kind of sense a shift and realize there was kind of a dysfunction. In this period of time, there was, the belief or faith in our institutions continued to decline. We saw a growing partisanship, rise of social conservatism, and things really were getting pretty ugly about this time. One of the consequences of this was we saw the government even further merges with business through this new medium of technology and the very people who were creating it in Silicon Valley. Because again, government both feared an educated population that was freely able to communicate with the rest of the world, as it may lead to a divergence from the national narrative, which at this point, at least since 2001, was now based in fear. And we all remember the alerts and the hyperbole of the media of every threats, both those that were plausible and those that were just absurd and fanciful. Now, of course, we also witnessed where, rather you may call him a hero or a traitor, but a guy named Ed Snowden, a CIA guy, he kind of showed everybody in America and the world that the government was basically kind of managing and monitoring every bit of information it possibly could. Every keystroke you make, every conversation you have, etc., etc. And it basically made privacy non-existent, and at least essentially non-existent. Now, and of course, to give you an example, I'm sure many of you have sent an email or a private message by, let's just say for an example, a Whirlpool fridge, a certain model. You log into your Facebook or your Twitter or something, and all of a sudden you notice an ad for the very fridge you were just talking about on a completely different medium. Kind of spooky, right? Well, in addition to that, social media also kind of became a realization of ELIZA. Now, ELIZA was a computer program that was written back in 1966 by a guy named Weizenbaum. Now, he wrote this program kind of as a parody, as a joke, that it was written to be like Sigmund Freud, where a person would type in a question, a problem, say, I'm having problems with my wife wanting whatever blue house paint. It doesn't matter what it is. And ELIZA, the computer program, would then respond by rephrasing the very question you just asked and repeating it back to you. So you're having problems with your wife wanting to choose blue, huh? Well, much to Weizenbaum's amusement, it baffled him, and it probably still baffles many people today. People became addicted to this. Now, they would sit there for hours at a keyboard, basically typing to themselves, to this program that basically asked them the very question they put in, just simply rephrased. And they would end up having a conversation with themselves. And they would do this for hours. And it was baffling, still baffling. And people would share their most intimate of feelings with this computer program because it was a mirror of themselves. Now, there was a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. This guy's name is Alexei Yurchak. And he wrote this book back in 2006. It was titled, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. The Last Soviet Generation. Now, the premise of this was about the paradoxes of life in the Soviet Union during the 20 years just before it collapsed. Now, his argument is that everybody knew the system was dysfunctional, it was failing. The problem was nobody could imagine an alternative to the status quo. They become so entrenched, they're committed to it. And both politicians and citizens were simply resigned to maintain a pretense of a functioning society. Now, over time, this delusion became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the fakeness was accepted by everyone as real. Now, we only have to look around us today and kind of can't help notice, kind of going towards hypernormalization, which was a term that he coined. Now, just look at a rise in political populism today, specifically Donald Trump. Now, the promises and the narrative live among shifting sands, a pinch of truth can hide behind a pile of lies. But because many people are simply willing to rationalize any level of banality or vulgarity, and the reason, or part of the reason, is because the alternative to this has been pretty much empty promises. Politics has kind of failed people. Our institutions seem to fail. And the things that they do seem to actually put out seem to benefit one group of people at the expense of another. We no longer have kind of a national good for all, or at least even a sense or a perception of it. So is it any wonder why today people seek out their bubbles, their echo chambers, their ELIZA, which are reflections of themselves, and why technology is more than happy to provide this to us. And it's a means of kind of, we acquiesce control of ourselves. We've given up. And the alternative, of course, if we step outside of our bubbles and we go out to meet others who also happen to spend a lot of time in their own bubbles, we already have a hard time kind of engaging with people, especially in our current internet environment, or the world of the net. And a lot of this is out of, again, that fear of toxic and degrading responses from those that disagree with us. Now, we only have to look just how people engage and surround themselves. Take a look at yourself, honestly. You don't have to reply to me on any of this, but look at your own Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Now, beyond the people like family or long-term friendships and things, I bet the majority of people will find people that simply agree with their views, especially new people they may not even may know out online. You will find yourself searching out for those things that most agree with your point of view. We refrain from opposition. Again, just like, we're taught never to talk about religion, race, or politics at the dinner table. We're looking for harmony. Nobody wants discord. Now, I think this is also part of why we also can't help but notice there doesn't seem to be any grand social movements like the 60s or even the labor movements of the 30s and 40s. Most social movements today, like Occupy, Tea Party, are kind of directed like our politics are. Again, they're focused towards more narrower segments of society. And none of them really seem to offer a greater vision or an end game that encompasses everybody. We have a lot of social politics that are very specific. It's become very personalized, just like our diet of information and things that interest us. We're in an echo chamber. And again, it's not just through that, but also in politics, I don't think it's any mystery to anybody why we don't see. Why are there no Teddy Roosevelts or John F. Kennedys or Dwight Eisenhowers or even Al Gores that come onto our stage that want to speak about big ideas and propose a vision or the need for societal commitments to larger things that benefit all of us? We no longer ask, can we do something? We ask, can we afford to do it? And if we can afford to do it, who does it benefit the most? Now again, as some ponder the rise of populism or how Trump gained office, is it any wonder that someone claiming to make a better world, to restore greatness and prosperity, no matter how banal or vulgar or empty their promises may be, again, that lack of vision or a plan from others, then at least offers a choice. And so people either end up following those who are base and vulgar, but willing to say things are broken, even if they can't fix them, or they simply escape into the hyperbole-free bubbles. Now, I don't agree with those folks who wish to unplug from civic or social conversations, but I do at least understand why they do that. Now, if I could wave a wand, I could easily fix our situation by a few relatively simple things and a couple of not so simple things. Firstly, remove all money from politics, save individual citizen contributions and small taxpayer subsidized stipends that are granted to candidates that can progress to a second round of a runoff primary system. This is essentially what is known as proportional representational voting, as opposed to what we currently have, which is known as plurality rule voting. And it's called Dugver's Law. And it ends up, in our scenario, always having two-party politics. And of course, we know the dangers of that. A lot of people have a lot of different opinions. We hear it all the time out there. You have more opportunity of the type of brand of sneakers you want to buy than you do politics that means so much to your life. It's either red team, blue team. And neither team really seems to be doing anything for people. So this kind of negates that. And we have plurality. You may have a lot of parties. You can have a Green Party and a Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party. And it's through consensus that things get done. Because no one party, that's not going to be this pendulum of back and forth like a ping pong ball game. And you're not going to distill everybody's views down into either this or that. It's not a football team. It's not a football game. People have a lot of strong ideas about things, but they're varied and they're different. And I myself am a pretty middle-of-the-road person. I agree with some things on this side, some things on this other side. Both sides pander to me, but neither one really does a damn thing. One of the other things I would do, simply make voting a national holiday. require every citizen to vote. Doesn't matter if you just punch a ticket, draw in Mickey Mouse, whatever. And gerrymandering of districts, which actually would occur naturally under proportional voting. And of course, end electoral college. It's unnecessary. Let the people's voice actually carry some weight. And, you know, as, who was it that said this? Not Oscar Wilde. Will Rogers, I think, or maybe it was Adlai Stevenson who said, in America, anybody can get elected president. That's one of the chances you got to take. So, but anyway, correcting the mechanisms is actually pretty easy. Finding both the political will to do it and restoring people's faith, not just in government or institutions, but perhaps instilling some kind of faith in each other where we can have a conversation without it always resulting to Hitler and kind of belittling others, and learn how to speak to each other on our own levels and speak to listen, speak to understand instead of just talking to reply. So, anyway, I welcome your thoughts and opinions, not just on any of my assertions, but this new format of video commentary. And anyway, have a good day, and hopefully it's sunny wherever you're at. Peace.